Good evening and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom Live. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and it's my privilege to welcome you into the Rabbi's study. During times of uncertainty, times when we can't quite see what tomorrow is going to bring, collectively and individually, we all yearn for a little prophetic power. We try to see tomorrow, but that comes very, very rarely in the world. As a second best to prophetic power is the power of history. To be able to look backwards and understand where we've come and how we survived other moments similar to this one. And tonight we bring wonderful scholar of history, Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University, is the leading scholar of American Jewish history, American Jewish life. His book, American Judaism, is the classic in the field. And many of his books, the book on General Grant and others, wonderful books that made contributions to our understanding of the American Jewish experience. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for coming on with us tonight.
Really a joy to be with you.
So let's begin with the crisis. In 2008, you gave a paper to the UJA in New York that outlined some of the implications of the Great Depression for Jewish life in America. Assuming that when this crisis begins to wane, we're still going to be facing a huge financial upheaval. How can we learn from the Depression experience for what's about to hit us as a community?
I think that the most serious impact of the Great Depression within the Jewish community, when of course needs go up and means go down, the most serious impact was in Jewish education. Lots of people, they needed to save money. The only way they could see to save money was to withdraw their children from Jewish, then supplementary school programs. We see during the Great Depression, some schools had declines of a third to a half. And we paid a huge price for that decline in Jewish education because there are only a few years generally when young people can get educated Jewishly. If you lose a few of those years, you don't make it up. And in many ways, that was the most ignorant Jewish generation rippling through. And I have to say, you mentioned my lecture. That was a rare case where an academic could have an impact on policy. Several of the Jewish federations said, we're not going to make that mistake again. We will protect Jewish education this time around. And almost all of our schools did, in fact, survive in 2008. Back in the Great Depression, of course, synagogues similarly lost a very significant percentage of their members, much more than in 2008. 2008 was a decline 20 to 40%, depending where. In some congregations, even Temple Emmanuel of New York had a dramatic decline of almost 50% at the bottom of the Great Depression. And again, this had prolonged implications. Many synagogues that had formerly had multiple rabbis now had one rabbi, and we see a big decline in the number of ordinees because there were no jobs, and those were important declines. Obviously, another big factor in the Great Depression, it was a tremendous decline in the number of Jewish children. There was a big article in the American Jewish Yearbook in the 1930s about demographic decline. That makes perfect sense. People don't have jobs. They don't want to bring children into the world. It's hard to know whether a short-term decline will have a similar impact, but if we are in fact to see a long-term economic decline, I have no doubt that that will be an impact. And the last thing that has great significance is during the Great Depression, and again, it's reflected in the American Jewish Yearbook. They wrote that American Jewry wasn't as focused on events going on abroad as formerly. In other words, all people could think about was economic decline and the condition of their own community, much as today, as we're speaking, you'd think the only thing going on in the world is COVID-19. We don't hear about other things. It's not that other things aren't happening. Nobody has the time and the bandwidth and the energy to pay attention. And as a result of that, in 1933, when Adolf Hitler rises to power in Germany, it doesn't galvanize the community the way it might have done had they been focused differently. And there is, it seems to me, a great lesson there, even for our time. We see disturbing things happening in various parts of the world. Hungary, Poland hardly get attention. Um, see big locust plagues in Africa, almost no attention at all. Our attention is only on one thing, but it behooves us to pay attention. I think that already we are seeing certain things that are seriously threatened in American Jewish life. It's fascinating that although it's only been a short time, um, uh, the Canadian Jewish News went out of business. The British Jewish Chronicle went into liquidation now. It looks like it will come out. Other Jewish newspapers, even major ones like the Jewish Week in New York, are deeply concerned. Will we wake up and discover that we don't have media, and that means we don't have a community? The role of Jewish media is to bind us together, to make sure that we know about other parts of the Jewish community that we wouldn't otherwise encounter. Will that disappear, and what are the implications? I think there's a lot of evidence that other Jewish institutions, JCCs, schools, and so on, synagogues, are going to be affected by the great, by what we're seeing now. Not necessarily badly. I think a lot of Jewish institutions have discovered that you can do a lot virtually, and that can be a big plus. You and I are talking. Um, Nobody I know thinks that's going to disappear the moment COVID-19 disappears. A clearly virtual engagement is going to be a big part of Jewish life. That's a positive. Um, uh, and I think in the Great Depression, Jews remembered some of the ties that bound them together. The story you heard from Jews who remembered the Depression was, oh, well, grandpa was Orthodox and the grandson was a communist, and they all shared the same house because Jews needed one another. And, a few people were working and they helped bring in funding for everybody else. So you lived together, and they had to kind of learn how to talk and engage one another. And that was a good thing. Um, I think even now, we are seeing how crisis reminds people why it's good to be part of a Jewish community. Many communities, including mine, provided what they called Seder in a box this year. And that was remarkable, and reminded people why we need an organized community and even how doing good has a ripple effect because, of course, Seder in a box meant that the people in the food business who had no income were employed to make the Seder and package it. And at the same time, it greatly assisted those who suddenly, sometimes for the first time in their lives, were making Seder on their own, apart from a large family. So it was a kind of win-win organized by the Jewish community. And there were lessons there that one hopes will be enduring. So there's more to say, but there are a lot of lessons from the past. I think there are lessons from the present. Yeah.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So help us understand, as a historian, you have your fingers on a number of moments in history, American Jewish history, and beyond that, Jewish history in Europe and elsewhere, where the community endured a crisis, where there was an upheaval, where history abruptly changed, material conditions, power relationships abruptly changed, people's assumptions about their world abruptly changed. How does a community cope with this? And specifically, because I think a lot of Jewish leaders are going to watch our conversation. They're going to ask, Professor, you know history. Tell me what I need to know as a leader, what crisis I need to go look at, and what values I have to embrace as a leader to help my community through this moment.
Um, so the most important thing for leaders to know is that everybody remembers how the leader acted and they're looking to the leader. So to give you a specific example, um, take Memphis, Tennessee in the 19th century. I think it's 1878. Terrible yellow fever epidemic in Memphis. Um, Now, what's interesting is that the rabbi in Memphis, whose name was Sam Field, he's remembered forever after on the basis of what he did during that epidemic. He stayed, he visited people. He must have had, I don't know, natural immunity because he survived, but uh, everybody remembered. And when he died, which was at least 40 years later, they still were talking about him and the epidemic. These are the moments that test leaders. People are searching for leadership, and when they find it, they remember it. That's why so many people watch Governor Cuomo. So that I think has always been true, and I could think of others. Gershom Sasha, similarly, was remembered. He led the Jewish community through the revolution, and his leadership really was transformative. It transformed him because people trusted him, and no longer was he beholden just to the trustees. He had gained his own reputation. He was the most respected Jew, and at the same time, um, the he's always remembered on the basis of what he did in some of those crises. And I have to say, without mentioning names, leaders who vanished at times of crisis. They were the first one out. They weren't there, or their leadership was seen as bumbling and inadequate. That was remembered as well and had impact once the crisis ended. And I have to say, when I look at some of these crises, what amazes me is sometimes it ends. Let's say, like the flu epidemic, and combined with World War I, you would have imagined full of changes afterwards. But all people wanted to do was normalcy. And in fact, when Harding ran for president, that was his words: normalcy. Let's get back to how things were. Yes, you can certainly point to changes, and I think that some of the immigration restriction legislation even resulted, and there are people who would argue that some of the things that happened in World War II really resulted from the events of that time. But I could see the American Jewish community in the short term similarly returning to a sense of our desire for normalcy. We want to go back to the way things were. It'll take a while before smart people will say, oh, well, actually, there are real differences. And that goes back to the crisis. One of my favorite examples, it also goes back to a plague. Um, there was a big plague in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, and the custom previously had been that only one person said Kaddish for the entire community, not the way we do it. One person represented the community. But so many people died. There was a lot of fighting in the community. I want to say Kaddish. I want to say Kaddish. So the great Rabbi Akiba Eger ruled that for a year, in this immediate crisis, everybody can say Kaddish together instead of the previous custom. And he made clear this is what he called Hora'at Shah, it's only for this emergency and so on. But obviously, people loved this new idea of everybody saying Kaddish. There were no more arguments, and rapidly that becomes, especially in the New World, that becomes the custom. Everybody forgetting that he had insisted it's just for now. And I think some of that will likewise happen. I was very interested to see some of these rulings that came down for making Passover easy. And I bet some of those ideas, Passover has become harder and harder. And a lot of Jews think, well, he can't make Passover. I got to go away. And suddenly the rabbi said, maybe there are leniencies. I think some of those leniencies are going to be permanent, notwithstanding the fact that the rabbis today, like Rabbi Akiba Eger in his day, insisted that it was just for a short time. So it'll be interesting, but I'm not as persuaded as some people that everything will change and nothing will be the same again. I'm not sure that's the way human beings operate. I think when a crisis is over, people are quite happy to go back to the familiar. Uh, and So, it'll be, I'm kind of coming down in the middle. Some things will change. A lot of things will go back, I think, the way they were.
Thank you. So I wonder if I could take advantage of the fact that we have this moment together and ask you a more general question beyond the crisis. Your book on American Judaism, first of all, is the most readable book of history I've ever enjoyed. And it's a very accessible history. Now, I want you to help me reflect on this. There's a quip that we rabbis use. Many rabbis have quoted this, that in an edition of Look magazine in 1964, the headline was "The Vanishing American Jew." Predicted that by the end of the 80s, there'd be very few Jews left in America. And the quip, of course, is that Look magazine is gone and we're still here.
Twice.
And of course, Hanson's law, the great sociologist, predicted that by the third generation, American ethnic groups disappear. And my children are sixth generation American Jews. So as you look at the course of American Jewish history, Jonathan, why are we still here? What is it that has kept the Jewish people, has allowed us to evade the fate of so many ethnic groups that have disappeared from the American scene?
Well, first of all, it's precisely the fear that we will not survive that paradoxically helps to ensure that we do. Every generation, really going back to the 17th century, has worried, oh, we will not survive. And, I mentioned the Great Depression. Um, in the Great Depression, young Jews abandoned the synagogue in large numbers. The young generation, they turned communist because capitalism clearly wasn't working. And in the most prestigious journal of the American sociological community, American Journal of Sociology, a learned article appeared proving that it was the end of the Jewish church in America because young Jews, they took surveys, they all said, we haven't been in a long time and we're not going to come back. And yet it didn't happen that way. A lot of efforts were made in World War II. A lot of money went to teach soldiers about Judaism through the Jewish Welfare Board and a lot of chaplains. And as they say, there are no atheists in the foxholes. And soldiers came back. And for a lot of reasons, we had the greatest religious revival of the 20th century in the 1950s. The numbers of synagogues built in the 1950s is astonishing, all those suburban congregations. So we worry, and rightly, and we ask ourselves, what is the weakness of the Jewish community? And then we work very hard. Oh, are Jews assimilating? Well, what can we do? And how can we bring them back? So the fear that Jews will not survive helps to ensure that they do. That's just like prophets. Prophets didn't want their prophecies to come true. They wanted people to change their ways. And if a prophecy came true, the prophet failed. Well, so it is with us. Rabbis are constantly uh, prophesizing that the Jewish community, will be lost unless we invest in Jewish education. Will there be one Jewish community in the year 2000? Yitz Greenberg wrote. Well, a lot of people were worried, and they worked to bring Jews together, and so on. Which actually was again, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg shows how significant he was. He wrote about the college campus as the place where Judaism goes to die, and worried in the 1960s. Jews were going to college and they'd had all this Jewish upbringing, and their professors told them this is all a lot of nonsense. And he worried that as more and more Jews go to college, Judaism would disappear. Well, the Jewish community invested enormously in Hillel and in Chabad and in other college programs. And today, not only are Jews still around, but everybody knows people who went to college and became much more Jewish. And college became a place where people discover their Judaism in Jewish studies classes and on their campus. So my point is, we are constantly probing what are the weak spots in our community. And when we discover those weak spots, sometimes in a crisis, we move to strengthen our community. And I think that is really one of the secrets of our continued existence. And in a way, the job of every generation of American Jews is to find out a way how we can muddle along for one more generation. How can we keep it going? Where can we invest? How do we make sure that the next generation remains Jewish? And while it's very easy to point to cases where it didn't work, we forget what's really amazing is, as you hinted, that this small community, less than 2% of America, has in fact managed to maintain its identity and managed in many ways to not only stay alive, but in many ways to thrive in the American setting, notwithstanding all those challenges. There are challenges, and we respond to them. And that's been our history from the beginning.
Thank you. That's great. So in that context, this last Rosh Hashanah, every rabbi that I know, including me, gave a sermon about the rise of anti-Semitism in America, because it was the year of Pittsburgh and Poway and so many others, and both warned people and commiserated with people. So as you look at the American Jewish scene and look backwards at American Jewish history, how do you read this anti-Semitism? Do you think that this will have a decisive effect on the internal life of the Jewish community?
Well, what is so fascinating about the COVID crisis is it kind of pushed anti-Semitism off the front pages of Jewish newspapers and off the kind of central agenda of most Jewish organizations. I think anti-Semitism has been somewhat cyclical in American Jewish life. Those who have been around a while, they remember we worried about anti-Semitism in the 90s, and there was a lot of concern about Black anti-Semitism in the 70s, and of course, the peak of anti-Semitism, and we're nowhere near that today, was really from the late 1870s through World War II. And remember, that shaped where Jews lived, how they worked, what kinds of schools they went to. Certainly, Jews do not face anything like that kind of anti-Semitism. But I think for young Jews, they thought anti-Semitism was history. It was something that people like me studied. They once destroyed the temple. They once hated Jews, and both in the past. And so even my own students were just shell-shocked by Pittsburgh and subsequent events. This wasn't supposed to happen. Historically, anti-Semitism has often led to Jewish revival. People say, well, I ought to know more about my Judaism to know how to respond, to understand why people hate Jews, what makes us distinctive, what's going on. And certainly, I think the contemporary anti-Semitism has put to rest the silly idea that, Jews are no different from any other white folk. Jews had become like the white masses, nothing distinctive at all. Well, clearly, anti-Semites on the left and on the right didn't get that memo. And I think a lot of Jews understand now better than they did before that being Jewish is different than just being part of a white a majority. So I think it will have an impact. I think much depends on what happens. When Pittsburgh happened, I was interviewed, and I said, a lot depends on whether there are other cases. When the Kishinev pogrom happened, the question was, is this the end of the 19th century, or is this a new norm for the 20th century? We know the answer to that, but they didn't quite know. I would say that Poway and a bunch of other attacks suggested to people that, yeah, maybe things have changed. And certainly that's the way it was seen. I think we are all more aware than we previously were of anti-Semitism on the right, and the rise of rightist and almost fascist around the world is troubling. One of the interesting things about anti-Semitism is it's found on the extreme right and on the extreme left. And I think Jews are increasingly aware of that, and sensible people. Deborah Lipstadt, I think, has talked about it a lot, that you got to, no matter what your politics are, you got to pay attention to both. And if you only see one side and not the other, you're being willfully blind. But it still remains to be seen what the long-term impact is. I think that American Jews do need to remember that there are lots of other groups, and always have been, that face prejudice, whether it's blacks or, in our day, Muslims or immigrants or Hispanics. And in many cases, they're much worse off than Jews are. And that's very, very different than the European Jewish situation. So that's a long answer. My sense is, I think that a young generation that thought anti-Semitism was something just in the past, good for historians to study, I think that's been exploded. I expect that there will be a lot more study of anti-Semitism, a lot more awareness of it, and a sense on the part of Jews that, hey, we're a minority group like a lot of other minority groups. Um, and that's important because I think too many Jews had thought, oh, we're now part of the majority and we've been fully accepted into that majority. And that was simply an illusion.
Thank you. I wonder if you'll permit me a last question, a personal question. I suspect that one could spend a lifetime studying history, Jewish history, American history, human history, and end up with a deeply bitter orientation toward the world, and see the story of human folly, of human cruelty. And I suppose that one can study history and find great hope in ingenuity, in heroism and courage. So, having spent a career and a lifetime as a student of history, what gives you hope?
Oh, I thought you were going to go, how do I balance it? And I was going
Well,
to.
I'll ask you that.
Oh,
I'll ask you that too. I'll ask you
yeah,
that
all
too.
right. Well, I'll give that answer. I was going to say that on Sunday and Tuesday and Thursday, I'm pessimistic. And on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm optimistic. And on Shabbat, I see how we can move from pessimism to optimism. Look, I'm optimistic. And what gives me hope? We're still here. No, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing that given all the efforts to wipe Jews out in every generation, they try to destroy us. We just said on Passover, and it's true. It's astonishing that Jews are still here. And I think not just still here, but what Jews have done and how Jews have innovated. And Notwithstanding the great transformations, yes, just look at today. Um, uh, well over 80% of Jews are either in North America or Israel. Jews are deeply concentrated now in two regions, and all the other places are getting smaller and smaller. That's totally different than what it was prior to World War II, when Jews were all over the world and it was assumed Jews are everywhere, north, south, east, west, and so on. The sun never set. That's an unbelievable change that we've moved in from in one generation from a Jewish community that is dispersed all over the world to a Jewish community that is concentrated in two major centers. And having weathered that change, we still have Jews who go to synagogue and say the same prayers and the same holidays and so on. And the success of Jews, as they've made that transformation, Jews have become, in every sense of the term, a first world people. In 1920s, majority of Jews did not live in the first world. In 2020, the great majority of Jews, I remind you, Israel's a first world country. The great majority of Jews live in first world countries. So there have been vast changes, and yet we've found ways to not only survive but thrive. And I think we have to continue to be very worried that Jews won't survive, and that will ensure that we do.
Well, thank you, Professor Jonathan Sarna, Brandeis University, and author. Thank you so very much for spending some time with us. And please thrive and stay well, and stay strong.
Wonderful to see you again. Stay well.
Take care.